The midday sun hammered down on the wooden planks of the town square, baking the dust into a haze that shimmered over boots and wagon wheels. A crowd had gathered, murmuring like a restless swarm, eyes flicking toward the small, trembling figure on the auction block. Clara stood there, chains biting into her wrists, shoulders hunched beneath the coarse burlap that barely concealed the curve of her pregnancy. Every whisper, every pointed finger landed like a whip across her back. She could hear them. Barren, cursed, fat. No one will want her. Their words cut deeper than the heat. Her mother's face appeared in the crowd, tight-lipped, eyes cold. For the price of a single cow, she had sold Clara as if she were livestock, as if dignity could be weighed and traded. Clara's throat ached, her heart pounding with a mixture of shame and disbelief. She had hoped, foolishly, for protection, for someone to step in, and yet here she was, exposed, mocked, humiliated. The wooden beams beneath her legs groaned with every sway of the platform, echoing her instability. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry slicing through the low murmur of gossip, as if nature itself pitied her. Then a shadow fell across the sun, a sudden presence that silenced the murmurs like a whip crack. Hank stepped forward, a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, his boots scuffing the dirt with measured authority. His eyes, dark and steady, burned with a quiet morality that unsettled the crowd. Dust clung to his worn duster, the sun glinting off a metal buckle, but it was the calm certainty in his stance that froze everyone in place. Without a word, he reached for her shoulder. His hand was rough but firm, grounding her. "I'll take her," he said, his voice a low rumble, more felt than heard. The words carried weight, and for a moment, silence fell like a shroud. The auctioneer's voice faltered, the townsfolk blinked, and Clara's chest heaved. Hope and fear warred within her. Who was this giant stranger? A savior or another captor? Her pulse thudded in her ears. The cow, tethered nearby, snorted in nervous agitation, its rope cutting into Hank's palm as he dragged it along. He moved with deliberate strength, pulling Clara from the platform, away from the jeers, away from the mother who had betrayed her. The crowd parted instinctively, murmurs rising again, some angry, some admiring the courage of the man, but Clara could hardly hear. Dust whipped around her face as Hank led her toward the open plains, boots kicking up grit that stung her eyes. Her dress clung to her sweat-slicked skin, and she fought the urge to stumble, clinging to his arm like a lifeline. Wind ripped through the square, flapping banners, rattling wooden signs, as if the town itself tried to hold her back. But Hank's grip was steady, unyielding, a promise she did not yet understand. As they passed the edge of town, the canyon rose before them, jagged cliffs outlined against a harsh blue sky. The sun glinted on jagged rock faces, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Clara's mind raced with questions, terror tangled with a fragile spark of hope. Would he protect her from the men and whispers behind them? Could she trust this stranger, who had plucked her from misery with the same hand that could crush a man's skull? The sound of the cow's hooves on dry earth faded as they moved deeper into the canyon. Clara's heart thumped in sync with Hank's measured steps. She drew in a breath of wind, heavy with the scent of sagebrush, dust and sweat, and felt the first flicker of life beyond shame. She clutched at her belly instinctively, feeling the new life within her, a life her mother had tried to barter away. Hank glanced at her once, just briefly, his stoic expression softening as though sensing the fragile trust forming between them. The canyon walls swallowed them in shadow and sun, dust swirling like a living thing around their boots. Clara's pulse slowed, though fear still lingered, a quiet echo in her chest. She realized that the world outside had been cruel, but this man, this giant, might be her first step into something safer, something real. And as they disappeared into the canyon, the auction square shrinking behind them, Clara allowed herself a trembling thought. Perhaps survival, perhaps even dignity, was possible after all. The plain stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun. The earth cracked and shimmering with heat. Dust swirled around their boots, clinging to sweat-slick skin and searing Clara's throat with every gasp. Hank's horse moved steadily, hooves kicking up clouds that stung her eyes. He rarely spoke, his jaw set, gaze scanning the horizon with a predator's awareness. Each glance he spared her was measured, protective. A silent promise that he would not let the cruelty of the town catch her again. Clara's arms trembled as she tried to mount her own horse. muscles trembling from fear and exhaustion. The reins slipped in her clammy hands, and her knees shook beneath the weight of her pregnancy. Hank's large hands wrapped around her waist, steadying her with a strength that was both intimidating and comforting. "Careful," he said once, voice low, almost gentle. She gripped the saddle horn, letting him guide her until she found balance, heart hammering in a mixture of terror and relief. The wind tore at her hair, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry grass. The plains seemed to stretch forever, unyielding and vast. Even so, the quiet companionship between them offered a fragile solace. They rode in silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves against sun-baked dirt and the distant caw of a lone raven circling overhead. Clara felt the weight of the world, her shame, her mother's betrayal begin to ease, replaced by a tentative trust in this silent giant beside her. As twilight bled across the horizon, the canyon rose before them like a secret carved into the earth. Jagged cliffs framed a hidden hollow, shadows stretching long across the cracked soil. Nestled within, a modest cabin appeared, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It seemed almost magical, a sanctuary untouched by the cruelty of the outside world. Clara's heart lifted, a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in months. Hank dismounted first, the weight of his frame pressing down on the dry ground. He guided Clara carefully, one arm around her waist as they crossed the rocky slope to the cabin. The fire crackled inside, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sank onto the rough wooden bench, her hands shaking as she ran a trembling hand over the grain. She was safe for now, but the wilderness itself tested that safety. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp against the wind. Shadows moved among the cliffs, and the chill of night crept into the hollow. Hank left briefly to check the horses, the cabin door swinging open to let a draft rattle the boards. Clara, alone, rummaged through her bundle and found a small silver locket. Its chain was tarnished, but the delicate filigree caught the firelight. She opened it and found a faded photograph of her mother, eyes staring back with a mixture of pride and cold detachment. Her chest tightened, betrayal and resolve warring inside her. She pressed the locket to her heart, whispering a silent promise. She would survive. She would not be bartered, not again. Footsteps crunched outside, dust disturbed by Hank's return. He scanned the perimeter, rifle in hand, eyes sharp, unyielding. Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest, a bond forming through shared silence, through protection offered without words. She could trust him. Perhaps for the first time she allowed herself to breathe. Then, a sound cut through the night. Hooves striking the canyon floor, uneven and urgent. Clara froze, every nerve alight with fear. Hank's eyes narrowed, muscles coiling as he moved to the doorway. The distant echo grew louder, carrying the threat of pursuit. Her fingers tightened around the silver locket, and for the first time she realized that escape was not a one-time act. Survival required vigilance, courage, and trust, and she would need all three. The fire flickered, casting elongated shadows over her face. Clara swallowed, heart thundering, as she rose to meet whatever or whoever was approaching. The canyon held them now, a fragile fortress against the world, but the threat was real, and the night was far from over. Somewhere in the distance, hooves struck again, closer this time, and Clara knew that danger would not let them rest. The cabin sat like a secret, stitched into the canyon cliffs, small and unremarkable from the outside, yet a sanctuary against the ruthless sun and open plains. Inside, it was sparse, a stone fireplace blackened with soot, a sagging bed with frayed blankets, and a single wooden chair, rough-hewn and uneven. Dust lingered in corners, catching the firelight, yet it felt safer than the auction block, safer than the judgmental eyes of the townsfolk. Clara sank onto the bed, every muscle screaming with fatigue, bruises and scratches painting her skin with the story of her escape. Hank knelt beside her, hands as careful as a surgeon's, washing a fresh cut along her arm. The water ran warm over her skin, dripping to the floor, and Clara flinched at the contact. But the brush of his hand against hers sparked something she couldn't name. She looked away, flushing, trying to focus on the sound of the fire, the crackle of dry wood. His face remained stoic, eyes unreadable, yet every motion spoke of unspoken care. Words were unnecessary. Trust was being built in silence. They ate together that evening, beans from a tin, bread hard and stale, but nourishing. Clara found her hands trembling as she stirred the beans, and Hank noticed, but said nothing, only sliding a spoon toward her, steadying it with a rough hand. Between bites, they exchanged fragments of conversation. Hank's reputation floated between the words, a drifter, feared by towns, respected in whispers for his unusual code of honor. Clara listened, piecing together a man both dangerous and principled, a man who might protect her when the world had not. Night settled over the canyon, curling cold fingers through cracks in the cabin walls. Hank stoked the fire, tossing on a few dry twigs, and the flames leapt with life. He handed her a cup of water, eyes briefly meeting hers, and Clara felt the quiet intimacy of survival wrap around her. Blankets were spread across the bed, the firelight painting dancing shadows on the walls. She wrapped herself in one, shivering against the chill, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a fragile sense of peace. Clara's eyes drifted to the silver locket, glinting in the firelight, dangling from the chain around her neck. It caught the flames and flickered like a tiny star, a reminder that even in a cruel world, moments of safety could exist. She pressed it to her chest, the cold metal grounding her, whispering that she could survive this, that she could endure. Hank moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, adjusting the fire, checking the walls, bringing her small comforts, a cup refilled, a blanket tucked tighter, a stool moved closer. Every gesture, silent and deliberate, spoke of kindness she hadn't dared hope for. Clara realized she had begun to trust him, though the thought scared her as much as it comforted her. Then suddenly a shout pierced the night, sharp, urgent, slicing through the stillness like a rifle shot. Clara froze, heart hammering against her ribs. Hank's jaw tightened. He grabbed his rifle, moving to the doorway, eyes scanning the canyon edges. The shadows seemed to tremble under the moonlight, and Clara's pulse raced. The past she had fled, the mother who had sold her as if she were cattle, was catching up. She clutched the locket, knuckles white, as a cold dread settled over her. Outside, the wind carried the faint echo of hooves and shouted commands. Hank's presence was a shield, yet even his vigilance could not erase the fear tightening her chest. The cabin, so warm and protective a moment ago, now felt fragile, a thin barrier against a relentless world. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement beyond the door. Hank glanced back once, a flicker of reassurance in his gaze, but his hand stayed ready on the rifle. Clara realized that safety was temporary, that trust and survival required vigilance and courage again. The night seemed endless, filled with the sounds of unseen predators. The cold weight of uncertainty pressing in, and the lingering reminder that even in sanctuary, the wilderness and human cruelty was never far away. Yet, in the flickering firelight, as she held the silver locket tight, Clara let herself believe in the first fragile ember of hope. They might survive this night. Together. Morning arrived like a blade across the canyon, cold and sharp, the first light painting jagged shadows on the cabin walls. Clara shivered under the thin blanket, her body stiff with bruises and fatigue. Hank moved quietly, unhurried, preparing the small basin of water by the fire. The scent of sage drifted in from outside, mingling with the damp warmth of the cabin. "We'll get you cleaned up," he said simply, his voice low, steady, unyielding. Clara let him guide her to the basin, his hands firm but careful. Each touch was a mixture of strength and gentleness. He lifted her with a confidence born of necessity, steadying her over rough floorboards and uneven stones. Water ran warm across her skin, washing away the dust, the sweat, the remnants of yesterday's terror. He handed her a simple shift, plain and rough-spun, yet soft against her battered body. She dressed slowly, aware of every movement, every glance Hank offered, his presence steady and unjudging. Once she was clothed, he led her outside. The canyon air was brisk, scented with dry earth and sagebrush, the sun low but promising warmth. They traversed uneven rocks, Clara clinging to Hank's arm as he guided her carefully, ensuring no misstep. He pointed out herbs growing wild along the cliff edges, leaves that could ease nausea, roots that could reduce swelling. Clara followed his instructions, chewing cautiously, letting the bitter taste mix with hope. The act of caring for herself with Hank's guidance felt revolutionary. As they worked, conversation bloomed in the small spaces between their tasks. Clara spoke quietly, words spilling like fragile water from a cracked vessel. She told him of the judgment she had endured, the whispers of townsfolk who had called her cursed, barren, unworthy. She spoke of her mother, of the betrayal that had led her to the auction block. Hank listened without interruption, eyes steady, face unreadable, absorbing her words with the patience of someone who had known loss. Slowly, he shared fragments of his own past, siblings lost to desert storms, betrayals by men he had trusted, a life honed to survival by lawless lands. There was no pity, no judgment, only understanding. Then a sharp rustle drew their attention. A hawk, its wing bent at an odd angle, floundered near the edge of the cabin clearing. Clara gasped, fear and sympathy mingling in her chest. Hank moved to it first, lifting the bird gently, examining the injury. "Careful," he murmured, handing it to her with the same cautious authority he had shown her. Together they worked, wrapping the wing with strips of cloth, murmuring soothing words, coaxing the frightened creature into stillness. The hawk blinked, its eyes sharp and bright, yet vulnerable, a reflection of their own fragile resilience. Clara's fingers brushed the cloth against the bird's wing, and for a moment she paused, glancing down at the silver locket glinting against her chest. It caught the sunlight, small and steadfast, a talisman of survival and trust. She pressed it lightly with her thumb, a silent vow. She would endure, she would grow stronger, and she would not be broken again. The hawk chirped softly, a sound of persistence and fragile triumph, echoing the new rhythm of her heart. But the fragile peace shattered suddenly. Across the cliffs beyond the cabin, a shadow stretched over the rocks, a dark silhouette that froze them both. Clara's chest tightened, eyes widening. Hank's jaw hardened, muscles coiling as he moved instinctively toward the door. The hawk stirred nervously in her hands, wings beating, as if sensing the unseen threat. The wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, approaching. Trust was fragile, Clara realized. Safety was a gift she could not yet take for granted. She clutched the silver locket once more, feeling its cold metal against her palm, grounding her, reminding her that even in the presence of danger, she had survived worse. Hank's gaze met hers briefly, unspoken reassurance passing between them. But the shadow remained, a looming question. Who had come? And would they destroy the fragile bond and sanctuary they had fought so hard to build? The canyon held its breath, silent and tense, as mother, predator, or lawless pursuer might step into their world at any moment. Clara pressed the hawk to her chest, eyes scanning the ridge, heart hammering. The wilderness was alive with threats. Yet in that moment, between terror and trust, she felt a sliver of strength take root. Weeks slipped by in the hidden canyon, each day a rhythm of survival and small victories. Clara learned to ride Hank's horse with cautious confidence, muscles remembering balance across rough terrain. She learned to forage wild herbs and roots, the bitter taste grounding her, teaching patience and self-reliance. She practiced with the rifle he lent her, the recoil jarring but familiarizing her with strength she hadn't known she possessed. Each skill rebuilt pieces of her dignity, once traded for a cow, now reclaimed with sweat and grit. Hank moved alongside her in silence much of the time, his stoic presence a constant and steadying force. Yet in private moments, fragments of vulnerability leaked through. A flicker in his gaze when he paused at a canyon's edge, a hint of sorrow when he spoke of people he had failed to save. Clara studied these cracks in the armor, and a bond began to form, not of words, but of shared loneliness and understanding. Their glances lingered, hands brushed by accident. Then with deliberate pretense, carrying an electric warmth neither dared name aloud. One night, the fire burned low, casting dancing orange shadows across the cabin walls. Clara sat close, knees drawn to her chest, and allowed herself to voice the fear she had buried beneath months of shame. "I'm afraid," she whispered, voice trembling. "Afraid of what will happen when the baby comes. Afraid of being rejected." Again, tears glistened along her lashes, catching the firelight like dew. Hank's hand found hers, steady, warm, and unflinching. He did not speak at first, only listened, absorbing her confession with a patience honed by years in the wilderness. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, low, and unguarded. He told her of a love he had lost long ago, a woman taken by circumstance and cruelty, and how the memory had hardened him, yet taught him to protect those left behind. He explained why he rescued her, why he stood silent and unyielding while the world had treated her as worthless. Each word was a fragment of himself laid bare, a glimpse into the scars beneath the stoic exterior. Clara's heart thumped with a mixture of sorrow, understanding, and fragile hope. In the quiet, she pressed the silver locket between them as they embraced, fleeting but tender. The metal glinted in the firelight, small and steadfast, a symbol of trust, connection, and the delicate bond forming between them. Clara's head rested briefly on Hank's chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that safety, and perhaps love, could exist even in a world carved from cruelty and dust. But the canyon's peace was fragile. A distant sound reached their ears, subtle at first, the muffled rhythm of hooves striking the canyon floor. Clara stiffened, recognizing the same danger that had stalked them before. Hank's gaze hardened, eyes narrowing as the noise grew louder, echoing off rock walls, a reminder that their sanctuary was not impervious. The bond they had nurtured, delicate as a seedling, now faced the harsh winds of pursuit. Hank rose, rifle in hand, moving to the doorway with careful precision. Clara followed, heart hammering in her chest, eyes wide, shadow stretching long across her trembling figure. The firelight flickered over her face, catching the glint of the silver locket still pressed against her chest. In that tense moment, suspended between hope and fear, Clara realized that trust was both a gift and a gamble, one that might be tested before the night was over. Outside, the canyon held its breath, the approaching hooves a promise of danger. Clara's fingers tightened around the locket, grounding herself. Hank's stance was unyielding, protective, yet she knew that even the strongest shields could be pierced. The world they were building together was precious, fragile, and perilously close to being threatened once more. The cabin lay quiet under the morning sun, cliffs casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Outside, Hank knelt in the earth, shaping a small garden with patient, deliberate movements. Stones were moved, soil turned, and tiny seedlings pressed into the dirt with careful fingers. Each gesture spoke of resilience, of hope, of life nurtured against harsh, unyielding land. Clara watched him from the doorway, heart stirring at the symbolism. Even in the midst of a cruel world, growth could take root. Encouraged, she stepped into the garden herself, fingers brushing the loose soil. She planted wildflowers along the fence line, a riot of color against the muted browns and reds of the canyon. Each seed was an act of reclamation, a defiance against the shame her mother had imposed. Dirt coated her hands, fingernails blackened and cracked, yet she smiled faintly. With every flower pressed into the ground, Clara felt herself reclaiming pieces of dignity stolen from her at the auction block. Her past humiliation was not erased, but she marked its passage in the soil, evidence of her agency, of the life she would choose. Days passed in quiet routine. The garden flourished under their care, a living symbol of survival and renewal. Clara found solace in the ritual, and Hank, who often lingered nearby in silence, occasionally offered guidance, a reminder of protection without intrusion. They spoke less of danger, more of possibilities. Which seeds would bloom fastest, where the soil was richest, how to coax the delicate stems to stand straight against the wind. Even the hawk from earlier circled above, perching occasionally on a fence post, its keen eye watching, a living sentinel. Then one morning, as the sun slanted sharply across the canyon, Clara's fingers struck something hidden beneath a small, flat rock near the corner of the garden. Heart racing, she lifted it, revealing a folded piece of paper, edges worn and corners curled with age. The handwriting was unmistakable, her mother's, jagged and hurried. Clara's breath caught as she read. A confession of regret, a thin apology etched in ink, acknowledging the cruelty of the past. Relief flickered, but it was swiftly replaced by icy dread. The note also carried a warning. A neighboring rancher had learned of her child's inheritance and intended to claim it. Using any means necessary, Clara's hands shook, the paper trembling as much as her pulse. Betrayal had never truly ended. It lingered, following her like a shadow she could not outrun. She looked up, and Hank was there, standing silently behind her. His presence was steadfast, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the cliffs beyond, as though he could already see the threat moving through the canyon. Clara's fear met his calm determination, and though her heart pounded, she felt a flicker of safety. Hank's silence was his vow. He would protect her, whatever the cost. The garden, once a symbol of quiet growth, now carried weighty significance. Each flower she had planted, each seed pressed into the soil, was a stand against the cruelty that sought to claim her life and her child. The silver locket around her neck caught the sunlight as she pressed it to her chest, glinting like a tiny, steadfast star. Clara's eyes widened, realizing that the trials of the past were not behind her. They were ongoing, layered and persistent, but she had allies, courage, and a sanctuary of her own making. She sank to her knees beside the garden, clutching the silver locket, hands digging into the soil as if anchoring herself to the earth, to life, to survival. The canyon walls seemed to close in with both beauty and threat, reminding her that the world outside the cabin was relentless. Yet in the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft bloom of the wildflowers, she drew a shaky, steadying breath. Her mother's machinations were far from over, but Clara's resolve, fortified by small acts of creation, would meet them head-on. Above, the hawk let out a sharp cry, wings slicing the morning sky. Clara lifted her gaze, the silver locket catching the light once more, a small talisman of trust, endurance, and fragile hope. And in that moment, as Hank remained silent behind her, she understood the lesson of the garden. Growth could take root anywhere, even in the shadow of betrayal. Dawn broke in jagged shards of pale gold across the canyon, cutting through the night like a knife. Clara stirred beneath the blankets, heart tightening at a distant rumble. The sound grew louder, a syncopated pounding that made the cabin floor vibrate. Hooves kicked up clouds of dust along the canyon floor. Her breath caught as she peered out the window. A line of men on horseback, rifles glinting in the rising sun, approached with deliberate menace. The bounty hunters had returned. Hank moved first, his presence sudden, commanding. His hands were steady as he checked the cabin's makeshift defenses, logs stacked against doors, hidden pits concealed with brush. Clara's stomach tightened. She had watched him build, hunt, and survive, but now the stakes were higher. Her pulse matched the rhythmic thunder outside, every thundering hoofbeat a drum of impending violence. Hank's gaze swept over her, eyes sharp. "Stay inside. Trust the traps," he said, voice low, unwavering. Clara nodded, though her hands trembled. The first wave struck at the edge of the cabin clearing. Horses screamed, men shouted, rifles roared, and the quiet canyon exploded into chaos. Hank charged forward, a mountain of motion and fury. He moved with calculated violence, striking down attackers with fists, rifles, and sheer brute force. Clara watched, heart hammering, as his enormous frame collided with theirs, scattering men like rag dolls. Dust swirled around the cabin, mingling with gun smoke, sweat, and the sharp scent of blood. Clara's fear, however, began to harden into determination. Her father's old rifle, once neglected in a corner of the cabin, now felt like an extension of herself. She loaded it carefully, hands steadier than she expected, and began picking off threats as they approached the traps. Hidden pits ensnared horses, vines and rocks tripped men who had underestimated the terrain. And Clara realized she was no longer the fragile girl traded like cattle. She was a force in her own right, a partner in survival. The battle raged, minutes stretching into an eternity. Hank's chest heaved with exertion, his large hands slick with blood and sweat, yet he never faltered. Clara fired again, narrowly missing Hank as he swung his rifle toward another assailant. Her pulse roared in her ears, adrenaline sharpening her senses. She noticed every detail, the angle of the cliff, the weight of her shots, the cries of men as traps were sprung. Together they moved as one, silent understanding forged in desperation. As the sun climbed, one enemy finally broke, retreating into the dust-choked canyon. "This isn't over!" he shouted, voice cracking, spitting promises of vengeance. Clara's hands shook, the rifle heavy, and she realized how close death had grazed them. Hank staggered toward the cabin, blood trickling along his side, muscles taut with pain yet unyielding. He leaned against the doorway for support, gaze sweeping the canyon. Clara rushed to him, fear and relief clashing in equal measure. He grimaced but allowed her to steady him, murmuring, "We survived. For now." But the moment of respite was fragile. Clara's eyes followed the canyon floor beyond the retreating men, tension rising anew. Someone else, more dangerous, was approaching. Their intent was unreadable, yet the shadow they cast stretched like a knife across the rocks. Place of uncertainty. Clara's hands tightened around the silver locket, a talisman of resilience as she braced herself for whatever awaited. Hank straightened despite the pain, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning the horizon. Clara met his gaze, trust mingling with fear. The wilderness around them held both sanctuary and peril, the fine line between life and death etched into every rock, every shadow. And as the first signs of movement appeared beyond the ridge, she knew the trials were far from over. Danger was coming, more cunning and merciless than before, and the canyon would not yield to weakness. The echo of hooves faded, replaced by silence heavy with threat, leaving Clara and Hank poised on the edge of the unknown. Every instinct screamed vigilance. Every heartbeat demanded readiness. The storm of violence had passed, for now, but the world beyond the cabin had not yet revealed its deadliest hand. The canyon's edge burned with the first light of dawn, cliffs glowing gold, and shadows stretching deep into the valley below. Clara crouched behind a jagged boulder, the rough stone pressing into her palms, grounding her. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as if drumming a warning. She gripped the silver locket, now warm against her skin, a talisman that had carried her through shame, betrayal, and fear. Today, it would witness survival. And perhaps love. Hank stood boldly in the open, a mountain of a man silhouetted against the canyon sky. His rifle gleamed, eyes scanning the advancing line of enemies. Clara's breath caught as she recognized familiar faces, her mother's enforcers, ruthless men armed and merciless, moving with the precision of predators. Every instinct screamed caution, yet she could see the faint spark of defiance in Hank's posture. He shouted orders, voice carrying over the wind, directing her attention to weak points in their positioning. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Dust kicked up from the horses' hooves as the first volley of gunfire cracked the morning silence. Clara flinched but steadied herself, drawing a shaky breath. Her moment had come. She aimed carefully, fingers steadying the rifle as taught by Hank's lessons, and fired at the lead horse. The animal faltered, hooves skidding on loose rocks, tossing its rider violently to the ground. Chaos erupted. Shouting men scrambled to regain control, weapons swinging wildly, and dust swirled thick enough to sting eyes and choke lungs. Hank charged into the fray, fists and rifle moving in perfect tandem. He struck with precision and raw power, sending one assailant sprawling into the canyon dust. Another came at him from the flank. He pivoted, rifle butt smashing the man's skull, then shoved him into a pit trap hidden beneath brush. Clara's stomach twisted with fear and awe. The man she had once been, shackled, humiliated, alone, would never have imagined this moment. Yet here she was, alive, weapon in hand, and ready to fight for the life they had carved out together. A distant shout drew her gaze. Another enforcer attempted to flank them. Clara's pulse roared, adrenaline sharpening her reflexes. She raised the rifle and aimed true, sending the man sprawling as the recoil knocked her slightly off balance. Her breath came fast, hot against her neck, but she did not falter. Hank roared, charging again, fists striking like hammers, rifle swinging, a tempest of motion and fury. Dust, blood, sweat, and raw emotion collided in a cinematic storm. The canyon floor shaking beneath the violence. Clara abandoned the boulder. Running toward Hank, determination surging through her veins. She fired and ducked, rolled behind rocks, and found herself side by side with him. Together they became a force of chaos and precision, striking at the enforcers with unyielding resolve. Each clash, each shot, each desperate maneuver was an act of survival and reclamation. She felt the rhythm of the fight, the raw connection of trust between them, their movements almost wordless, instinctive. The battle stretched on, seconds drawn into an eternity. Finally, the remaining villains faltered. Horses bolted, men stumbled, confusion splintering their ranks. One by one they retreated into the canyon shadows, leaving only dust, the metallic tang of blood, and the echo of shouts fading into silence. Hank and Clara sank to the ground, trembling, covered in sweat, dirt, and blood, but alive. Hearts still hammering, they clung to each other, breaths ragged, grounding themselves in the reality of survival. Clara pressed the silver locket into Hank's hand, feeling its small weight as both anchor and emblem. He held it for a moment, eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Triumph, relief, love, and trust. The canyon seemed to exhale around them, the wind lifting dust and carrying away the echoes of violence. leaving quiet in its wake. Hank pulled her close, arm steadying her, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "We made it," he said simply, voice raw but certain. Clara's arms wrapped around him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. She felt the pulse of life between them, fierce and unbroken. They rose slowly, surveying the aftermath. Broken weapons, scattered dust, and fading hoofprints told the story of struggle and victory. The canyon, once a place of refuge, now bore the marks of confrontation, yet in its rugged beauty, it promised endurance and sanctuary. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the scene, illuminating wildflowers and soil turned by hands that had fought, cared, and survived. Clara exhaled deeply, glancing down at the silver locket, glinting in the sunlight. It had witnessed humiliation, fear, trust, and now triumph. Her fingers tightened around it instinctively, a reminder that even in a world forged of cruelty, life, courage, and love could bloom. And as she looked up at Hank, their eyes met. Unspoken vows passing between them. They had faced darkness and emerged together, stronger, bound by survival, resilience, and something far deeper than either had expected. Winter arrived quietly, blanketing the canyon in a pale frost. Icicles clung to the eaves of the cabin, and breath rose in misty plumes with each step across the frozen ground. Clara moved through the crisp morning air, hands coated in soil, tending the wildflower garden she had planted months ago. The flowers were hardy now, stems straight and petals bright against the muted earth, a testament to resilience and care. Each bloom was a reminder of the growth she had forged from pain, betrayal, and survival. Hank followed, careful but steady, carrying water for the tender plants and brushing frost from the young shoots. His presence was calm, protective, the weight of past battles and hardships softened by quiet companionship. Clara smiled faintly as he knelt beside her to adjust the soil around a stubborn root. Their glances lingered, fingers brushing occasionally, small gestures heavy with unspoken affection. The canyon, harsh and unforgiving in summer and fall, now felt like a sanctuary sculpted by their hands and shared courage. Prominently on a wooden post beside the cabin, the silver locket hung, catching the winter sunlight in a steady glint. It was no longer a talisman of shame, barter, or humiliation. Instead, it stood as a monument to survival, love, and resilience, a symbol of the journey Clara had endured, and the life she had claimed alongside Hank. Each reflection of light on the metal reminded her that trust, courage, and small acts of care could conquer even the deepest wounds. Footsteps crunched softly on the frozen earth. Clara turned to see her mother approaching, her figure diminished, shoulders slumped under remorse and the weight of recognition. There were no words, no grand gestures, no apologies that could undo what had been done. Yet in the stillness of the winter canyon, a wordless nod passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of closure earned through endurance rather than confrontation. Clara's chest tightened, a mix of lingering sorrow and relief settling over her. Hank's arm wrapped around her shoulders as they watched the mother retreat, a shadow diminishing against the pale sun. Clara leaned into him, the warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart anchoring her. Their hands intertwined naturally, a silent vow that no past cruelty could unravel the bond they had forged. Around them, the canyon exhaled in wind and frost, silent witness to lives rebuilt from dust, courage, and determination. Above, a hawk soared, circling the canyon rim with keen, bright eyes. Its flight was effortless, a perfect echo of the moment months ago when they had nursed the injured bird back to health. The memory of that first act of care, the small lesson in resilience and compassion, now found its reflection in Clara's own life. She watched the bird rise higher, wings slicing the cold air, and allowed herself to imagine her child soaring into a life shaped by choice, love, and freedom. The cabin stood sturdy, smoke curling from the chimney, a fortress shaped by hands and hearts alike. Clara placed a hand on her swelling belly, feeling the life within her, a tangible reminder of survival, hope, and enduring connection. Hank's gaze softened as he touched the silver locket dangling from the wooden post, fingers brushing the glint of sunlight across its surface. The symbol had traveled with them through shame, danger, and violence, and now it rested in quiet triumph, a marker of growth and protection. They moved through the garden together, tending, laughing quietly at small triumphs. eyes scanning the horizon for the occasional coyote or the flutter of distant birds. Winter's chill was sharp, but it carried a promise that the canyon could hold beauty and life alongside danger and hardship. Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The past, with all its cruelty and betrayal, was finally at rest. She looked at Hank, his shadow stretching across the snow-dusted ground, and allowed herself to fully exhale. The hawk cried overhead once more, a reminder that freedom, care, and love endured. The canyon held them now, a place of sanctuary and strength. In the glint of the silver locket, in the bloom of resilient flowers, and in the warmth of hands intertwined, Clara understood. They had survived. And they had triumphed, not through vengeance, but through endurance, courage, and the quiet power of connection.